Welcome to the Teen Life Podcast, where we believe that teenagers are not a problem to be solved, but we are here to help you equip teenagers through the power of connection. Hey guys, this is Chris Robey, and back at it with me is Karlie Duke.
Hello.
Hey Karlie, so we are talking a lot about mental health on the podcast lately, and we have had certain runs where we've kind of touched on certain topics, and especially in an earlier iteration of the Teen Life Podcast, we did quite a few interviews with experts on mental health. But this is a topic that we get asked about a lot and is in the conversation with teenagers, and that is the topic of anxiety. And we want to spend some time today talking through anxiety, what it is, what it isn't, when to be concerned, because as we talked about in other episodes, our nervous system is at pretty high alert all the time right now. We have lots of inputs. We don't rest very well. There's just a lot of things that are competing for our attention and our time, and it just causes things to feel like they're overloaded all the time. And so you're going to get a lot of teenagers, especially developing, that they don't know how to handle all this. And that's why it's such an important part of our conversation.
Right. And I think just if you think back of when you were a teenager, that lack of control, sometimes insecurities that come up. And so I think at a minimum, anxiety kind of lives in the background for a lot of teenagers. But for some, it is chronic enough, serious enough that it can interfere with their ability to go to school, to make friends, to be in healthy relationships, to participate in extracurriculars and hobbies. And so that's really what we want to talk about today. Is I feel like we've talked about and I can link these. We've done an episode on anxiety, like you've said. We've done one on social awkwardness, but today I also want to talk about anxiety from a more serious standpoint of like when it is debilitating, when it does impact their actions and what they're doing. What does that look like, and how can we help them? And so let's start just, Chris, like, what are the signs? And obviously this is going to differ from kid to kid. So they're not all going to look the same. And honestly, these can cover, like when I was looking them up, I was like, oh, that's a lot of different things that it can be. But I think excessive fear, worrying, kind of that feeling of inner restlessness. They can be wary or vigilant. In social settings, they might appear dependent or withdrawn or uneasy. A lot of times in social settings, that's really where you see it come out. And then they're either sometimes overly restrained and quiet, or even overly emotional.
That's depending on how they process it.
Right, exactly. So that can kind of swing both ways. And then they might have like these preoccupation with worries of like losing control, or maybe you might even think their worries are unrealistic and kind of be like, why are you even worrying about that?
Right. And some kids kind of run hot on this kind of stuff anyways. You hear parents say, my kid's just kind of anxious, overly anxious. And, I think some of that can be, seasonal. There's certain times, or maybe even certain times of the day, or certain things, is coming up that that they're just run a little hot on their emotions, and they're showing this where they're fidgeting, or, biting their nails, or any of those kinds of things, which we're going to talk about the physical symptoms here in a second. But you're right. This isn't like really out of the ordinary behavior for most people at some point,
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. And I think that's where, when you're seeing several of these, and when you're seeing it paired with, like we said, like they're not able to do normal activities, or it is like they're staying home instead of going out because of these worries, that's when you really want to pay attention to it. But as Chris said, there are also physical symptoms. And I feel like where I've heard from parents bring this up is kids will be like, I can't go to school because of XYZ, and they're doing physical symptoms, and parents get really frustrated and maybe even sometimes think they're making it up. And sometimes that can, like, these mental health issues can manifest in actual real physical symptoms. And they're really feeling them. So sometimes it looks like muscle tension and cramps, probably just from like being that, like holding that in all the time, stomach aches, headaches. They might have pain in their limbs or in their back, fatigue, like being really tired often. Sometimes discomfort associated with like puberty changes. They may, I pulled some of this, and I'll obviously always put my sources in the show notes, but one of them say they might blotch. And I was like, what does blotch mean? I had to look it up. And then when I was like, oh, like blotchy, like their skin gets blotchy is what that means. I just like wasn't putting that together. But they might be flushed, they might sweat, hyperventilate, tremble, startle really easily. And so those are some of the physical symptoms that you might see if your teenager is struggling with anxiety.
I also think too that, sleep patterns would be affected as well. If you're in a time of high anxiety, I know if I'm anxious about something, I don't sleep well.
Yeah.
And
eating,
which obviously
eating habits probably too. Along with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that would contribute to the fatigue as well that you listed here.
Yeah, definitely. So just to get a little bit into causes, which I feel like sometimes is a guess because we don't always know what's happening, but some researchers believe that there is a predisposition towards like being timid and being nervous, and that is something that kids or people are born with. One thing to note too is I also saw that especially if one parent is naturally anxious, there's a good chance that their child will also have those tendencies, whether that is genetic or because it's modeled in their home. And so, like I said, like a parent's own uneasiness or an adult in their life that they're very close to, if they are having feelings of unease, it is going to also translate into the child. And the tip today we're going to talk about how to be a non-anxious presence for your teenagers. So we'll talk about that at the end of the podcast, so stick around for that. But it's just very interesting that can play out that way, that sometimes they're predisposed.
You got this.
I don't know that. I'm just going to move on.
Predisposed.
Thank you.
That's it.
Thank you, Chris. I'm going to move on.
I know words.
But yes. So it's interesting to look into that kind of stuff. And sometimes you might need to look at their environment and see what's going on that could be causing that as well.
That's so interesting too. It's nature and nurture conversation, and how a student arrives, you really just can't tell. I think that there could be a mix, obviously, of just genetics, but also I do think the modeling thing is really important. And I'm excited that we're going to be talking about this towards the end, because I think we do have at least play some role in helping alleviate some of those anxieties. But I think that's really interesting you brought that up.
Now, when it comes to consequences of anxiety, I think some of these, when you hear them, you'll be like, oh, that makes sense. But I don't know that we always think about it. School avoidance is a big one, I think, that we see with teenagers. And we did an episode on back to school anxiety after the pandemic. But like if there's a change at school, if they're moving schools, if they're moving from middle school to high school, or they had a bad experience at school, maybe with a friend or a teacher, that can lead to anxiety that then makes them not want to go to school. And so that's something. It could also be triggered by something unrelated to school, a divorce, an illness, a death in the family, something like that, or something tragic that happens to them. We talked about school shootings recently. That obviously can lead to anxiety. And so some kids might be fearful about that, of like, am I safe? Is this something that I need to be worried about? And then just as far as we see this, Chris, in our groups, but a worried or anxious teenager performs less well at school, in sports, and in social interactions. And so it's something that isn't just mental health. It bleeds into other areas of their life, and it is going to impact how well they perform in those as well, which can then lead to more anxiety.
Well, too, I think if you have a student who is conflict avoidant, or there's something happening in their life where there's relational conflict, between peers, I think that can cause a lot of anxiety too, especially if it's, socially or, social media driven, any of those kinds of things where it would just cause where they know they got to deal with something. And a lot of students just don't even know why they feel anxious. But a lot of times there's some kind of a relational conflict that they're dealing with that they don't know how to deal with, or they don't want to deal with. Can bring up that anxiety as well, to add to the list of all these other consequences.
I will say, just anecdotally, I've had good friends and family members who have struggled with anxiety. And I, especially as a teenager and as a kid, would have always said, and probably my parents too, that I was a worrier,
Mm-hmm.
but anxiety is different.
Mm-hmm.
And so I want to point out before we kind of go into like how we can help teenagers, know that like it is, I've said this before, like I wish I could understand and I don't. Even as empathetic as I can be towards someone who struggles with anxiety, I'll never know exactly what that feels like, because
Mm-hmm.
just being worried about something and having like actual anxiety that changes the way that you act or think is very different.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Great
I
point.
just think going into this, like trying to have understanding for our teenagers, but also knowing like I might not be able to put myself in their shoes and I might not understand. They also probably don't understand what's happening or why they feel this way. And
Absolutely.
that's a scary place to be. I think some questions that we get, Chris, is when it comes to anxiety, like, can I handle this on my own, or do we need to talk to a professional?
Yeah, and before you jump into this part, I think this is important, because when we talk about mental health, a lot of terms are thrown around, and oftentimes are not given the same level of weight or importance. So you'll hear this conversation a lot around trauma, where even to where now people talk about big T trauma and little T trauma. So like people will say just off the cuff, "Oh, I was just so traumatized by that," when that's not really what we're talking about here. And sometimes anxiety and depression can be thrown there too, where it's like, "Oh, I'm so anxious," or my anxiety is crippling me, when, like you talked about, maybe you're worried. And so this is really where, if you are in doubt, might be good to kind of pay attention, lean in on this part of the conversation, because we don't ever want to discount, but we also too want to make sure we know how to just cope with basic life stresses. It's when it enters the public zeitgeist, it can really be misunderstood.
Sure. So when it comes to, I don't want to say when it's bad enough, but when maybe it's serious enough to seek a professional, kind of the rule of thumb that I saw is if fearfulness or worry or anxiety takes over your teenager's life and limits their activities, or if their anxiety lasts for over 6 months, it's best to seek a professional. I'll also say if your teenager comes to you and says, "I think I need to talk to a professional," I would take that very seriously.
Absolutely.
Even if you haven't seen these yet, trust them and know that they know their mind and their body better than you do. And like, it probably won't hurt for them to go talk to someone that's not you, and get the help that they need. I will say too, I've read that sometimes different medications or illnesses can cause anxiety or cause symptoms that look like anxiety. So it might be worth talking to your child's pediatrician or doctor first to kind of see like, hey, is this could this be a symptom of a medication that they've been taking? Or this is what we've been seeing. If you feel like you need to go down that route too. I will say in most cases, like if you're kind of wondering, well, what does treatment look like for anxiety? It's going to be different from case to case, but they're going to focus on reducing the symptoms of anxiety. They're going to talk about relieving their distress. They want to prevent complications. And obviously, the main thing that a professional or a counselor is going to want to do is minimize the effects on their social life, their school life, and their development. And so sometimes that might look like, let's come up with coping skills. Sometimes that might look like medication, but it's different for every kid, and it's different probably for every counselor too. Let's talk about, Chris, though, like if you feel like my teenager is not at the point where they need a professional, or maybe they are seeking a professional, but how can we help them outside of that too, whether that is at school and you know that you have a student who's anxious, or in your home and you have a child who's anxious? Like, let's talk about how you can respond and help them as well.
Well, if they're willing to talk about their fears and their worries, stop and take time to simply listen. Anxiety is often induced just by the sheer volume of things that are happening. And if you as a parent or helper are too busy to even stop and listen or take it seriously, that would increase that anxiety. And so take time to stop and listen. try to help them track those feelings and what triggered it. And so whether or not it's kind of keeping a real-time journal or, a note on their phone like, hey, and there's some mindfulness stuff with that too. We've talked through mindfulness before, to be able to understand, it's not normal to feel up here all the time. If you've not felt a sense of peace or just feeling, calm, maybe track what that feels like as you move throughout your day.
Sure. I also think reassuring them that like their concerns are real, even if you're sitting there going like, they don't need to be worried about that, or they can totally do that. Be like, hey, I understand your concerns, or like, I see that you're concerned about this, but also pointing out like you're probably more than likely capable of handling it. And I feel like something we do a lot in our groups, Chris, is even saying like, let's think back on times when you were worried about this and it turned out okay.
Right.
And bringing that back in of like, all right, you have done hard things. You have survived things like this that have happened before, and you can do it again.
Right. I think there's a lot of great content out there on just techniques around dealing with the anxiety, at least just to kind of make it, at least help it be more manageable. And the non-clinical setting, and most of the stuff that you see out there, even if it doesn't work, isn't necessarily going to harm you. So many stuff, we talked about breathing techniques on this podcast, and it's never going to hurt you to breathe more. But just things that you sometimes it's a simple Google search, or just trying to find some really good stuff, or like the numerous places we've talked about on this podcast of ways you can deal with anxiety in the future.
Yeah, I also think, especially if your student is feeling like they need to limit what they do because of anxiety or because of worries, recognize when they do something that they don't want to. And hey, I know you didn't want to go to that, or I know that was really difficult for you, and I'm proud of you. And I would say, especially as adults, if we can say and recognize like, hey, you tried, and that's what matters, not even how well it turned out. Like, hey, you tried a new sport and you might not be the best at it, but you got out of your comfort zone and you tried it, and recognize the effort that's going in. And then we can work on like, how can we get better in that? But like, I think sometimes it's easy as parents or as adults in their life to like focus on the end result. And sometimes it's really just that they got there. And then finally, I'll say just some quick things not to do. Don't discount their feelings. I think that's a big no-no. Don't kind of be like, you're worried about nothing. This is silly. Don't say stuff like that to them.
Right.
That can be really harmful. And don't rush their process. I know that that's hard to do sometimes, but patience is really, really key when talking to a student with anxiety. And I will say next episode, we're going to talk more in depth about panic attacks or like panic disorder. So if your student has anxiety and it is showing itself as a panic attack, we'll talk about those specifically in the next episode. For the trend this week, Chris, I kind of want to continue. Last week, we talked about college decisions, and I just briefly wanted to talk about gap years, because I think this is something that is coming up more and more, especially since the pandemic. I saw the Gap Year Association, and I'll post their link, but they estimate on average that between 40,000 and 60,000 students take a gap year each academic year. And that number rose to an estimated 130,000 students during the 2020-2021 school year. So that first year after the pandemic.
So Karlie, before we was this a thing when you were graduating high school? I don't recall when this being a thing.
No. I don't think as much. When I was in school, I knew more people that did this, but this sounds bad. People that I knew that took gap years, typically it was seen like as they couldn't cut it, or they were struggling with something outside. You know what I mean? It wasn't looked at like, oh, cool, they're taking a gap year to find themselves. That's not really how it was viewed.
Interesting.
But I'll say now it's seen kind of as a semester or a year of like, they're getting experiences, they're learning. It often takes place either in between high school and college, or in between college and starting their career. So you can kind of see it two places of maybe they take like after college and before they start their job or trying to figure out what they actually want to do, they might take a gap year in there. Some choose to take it in the middle, but that's kind of mostly when you see it. But they might travel, they might volunteer, they might find a job or do a short-term program, because that's what the Gap Year Association does, is they help students access kind of opportunities. And there are lots of programs out there that are just a semester or a year that you can go and do, and that's their specific purpose. And so I'll say benefits. There really are some benefits. It can offer a break for mental health if students just need a break. It can give them life experience. If you have a student maybe who you're like, I don't know if they're ready to go to college, or they haven't had a lot of experiences traveling, and having a job could really help that. Some do it to work and save money so that when they go to school, they're better set up. It also helps them figure out what they actually want to do. If they're going into college going, I have no idea what they want to do, maybe take a break and make sure you're not wasting time on classes that you're not actually going to end up using, or wasting money going to a school that's not going to be helpful for you. And then also maybe a student didn't get into the school that they wanted to get into. And so they could take a year or semester and take community classes or something to kind of bulk up their resume and try again.
Yeah, I can see, if your student has that that margin or that privilege to be able to do that, I think this could be incredibly helpful, especially, just around uncertainty. There's just, think about if this was a thing whenever I was in the college years of, because I didn't know what I wanted to do, and I know a lot of students don't. There's a lot of pressure in that of like making that choice. And I could see this, if it's an available option, saving a student from making kind of a bad decision when it comes to their schooling or kind of what's next, because they didn't have the time to really, make that decision.
Yeah. I will say some quick advice that I found while I was looking into this. Experts advise you, if they think they might want to go to college, go ahead and apply for that in high school, even if they're going to take a gap year. There are just more resources available. There are school counselors that can help you. And then kind of maybe after you get admitted into that school, most schools have some sort of policy for a gap year and that you can defer your enrollment. And so that's a conversation that you can have after. I'll say keep your options open. I saw that there were lots of people who said, like at the beginning of their senior year, they thought, I'm definitely doing a gap year, and didn't apply to school. And then at the end, when everyone was graduating and all their friends were going to school, they were like, oh, I don't know if I want to do a gap year anymore. But by that point, they had limited themselves. And so take all the options you can, and then you have a decision instead of being forced into a gap year. And then finally, I'll say gap years are most effective when they're actually doing something. When there's a plan. Just saying I'm taking a gap year and staying home and laying on the couch or playing video games is not going to set them up for success in the future. So make sure they have a plan. Make sure they are doing something that is going to help them with their eventual career. Whether that's college or not, doesn't have to be college, but just make sure that you are helping your student set themselves up for success. Okay, finally, Chris, let's get into this tip of how you can be a non-anxious presence for a student. And I'll just say that kind of when I think of non-anxious, this is someone who is calm, they're focused, they empower others to be relaxed. They're not kind of like bringing up the stress level because they're stressed, if that makes sense.
And I think if you're listening to this, you know exactly who we're talking about, right? I mean, we all have that person in our lives that we're like, man, I want more of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely. And so some tips that I have for being non-anxious, especially with teenagers. The first thing is don't get too drawn into their story or their drama. We want to listen. We want to be really good listeners and be respectful of their feelings. But if you can be an unbiased listener. So if you get caught up in their emotions, if you're like, man, I can't believe they do that, and you start crying with them or things like that. We talk about being shock proof a lot on this podcast. But if you get drawn into that, it can actually make their anxiety feel validated instead of empowering them that it's something that they can overcome.
I think also just trusting your instincts. Take a deep breath. Trust your gut, so to speak. You don't have to get caught up in having to say the right thing all the time. Just be a curious listener and be present. Be vulnerable, but be a steady presence. Oftentimes, your answers or your advice are just not actually what they need. But being willing to just say, well, this is kind of how this strikes me, but I'm more interested in what you think. But being that curious listener can be the best thing for them.
Mm-hmm. I also think it's important to kind of set your judgments aside before you go into conversations. Make sure that they want feedback and advice before you give it. And if they do, try to give it in a way that shows support, not judgment for things that they've done in the past or how they're feeling. And like I said at the beginning, if you've never struggled with anxiety, you might never understand. And so try to set that aside of like, I can't judge them based on how I feel, because that's not fair.
I think one of the best antidotes for judgment is good questions. And so it's hard to judge people when you're asking good questions. We really believe in this at Teen Life, and we talk about it a lot, of just asking curious questions, not necessarily questions that are leading or trying to get you to a certain place. But just know that your questions are really important, and qualify your questions if you need to. If a question, feels more judgmental than you're trying to get across, explain why you're asking the question, just to make sure you understand better. But while you're doing this, modeling, staying calm, and regulating your own emotions is one of the most powerful things you can do for someone who is anxious, of presenting yourself as that calm presence in the middle of an anxious storm in the life of a teenager. So with that, we're going to call it a wrap on this episode. We're so glad that you joined us. We ask, as always, that you subscribe to our podcast. It's the easiest way to find our content every Tuesday. Follow us on social media to see what's happening with Teen Life and find really great content, additional content that we provide for the helpers, for those of you guys who are here for teenagers just like us. Text this episode to a friend, especially if you have a friend who has a teenager who's dealing with anxiety. This would be a really helpful one to send on. Review us on your favorite podcast app. Make sure that people know that this is something worth listening to, because we think it is. And with that, we will see you next week.